one of the things the book did extremely well was it kind of made characters almost of these two places, Long Kesh and somewhere guys would go kind of before Long Kesh, which was Castlereagh. You actually you described you compared Castlereagh to like Orwell's Ministry of Love. It was a very apt comparison. If you were to be sitting down with, maybe we'll say, like a fellow American who's semi-familiar, who might be like, not that you're semi-familiar, but an American who's like semi-familiar with the Troubles, how would you go about explaining this House of Horrors, Castlereagh?
I don't know if Americans would have anything really to compare it to. Maybe African Americans in Los Angeles during the 1960s, when they were taken to a place called the Parker Center. Uh, Castlereagh really was, which was a police station, but Castlereagh really was a lot more than that. It was what I would call a confession factory. It was just the name Castlereagh in Belfast, in the nationalist community during the time that it operated, was a code word for, it just induced dread in anybody who would be taken there or who had a loved one taken there. A lot of people would be rousted in the wee hours of the morning after their front door was kicked down and taken in there, have their watch taken away, shoelaces, etc., and isolated from family and from a lawyer for up to 7 days, kept in a tiny holding cell, 7 foot by 7, where there were steam pipes. The holding cells in Castlereagh were overheated. The RUC wanted their prisoners to be dehydrated, to lose track of time, to not have any sleep. The overhead light in the cell was kept on 24/7, to make sleep impossible. And in between spells in those holding cells, the prisoner would be taken to what they called interview rooms, where usually two-man teams of detectives would interrogate their prisoner, for hours on end. And they could keep you up to 7 days in there without a lawyer. So, as you might guess, there were many false confessions in Castlereagh. There were also beatings and physical abuse of detainees.
I guess you are a lawyer, not working this type of law, but you might explain kind of how absurd some of the kind of legal practices were. I mean, you just mentioned there, like not being allowed to have a lawyer for like 7 days. That's incredible. On a slightly lesser level, there was these more kind of informal things that would go on, like the guards shouting the addresses of Republican prisoners in full earshot of loyalist prisoners who could then make use of it in their own way.
Yeah, the detectives in there were guilty in many instances of physical and psychological abuse of prisoners. And when it came to, Catholic prisoners, particularly, all of those things that you mentioned were done. And the psychology of false confessions was one of the interesting topics that I got to research during the gift of being able to work on this project. And there's more data now on the phenomenon of false confessions than there ever has been before. And it's certainly not unique to the 6 counties during the Troubles. I mean, there were plenty of false confessions in the U.S. courts for many years, and there still are in many cases. But the goal of detectives, and this came down from their superiors, was to get the confession. And from a policing standpoint, you can understand the efficiency of it or the economy of it, because a defendant who has confessed to a crime, essentially has, done the detective's work for them. They don't have to go out and interview witnesses. They don't necessarily have to do forensic work, and at the trial, the confession is, a game ender. It has a huge impact on the judge, and in the diplomat courts, it was just a judge hearing these trials rather than a jury. So getting the confession was everything in Castlereagh during those times. And, as you would expect, there were a great number of of false confessions, and just a great volume of cases in which the principal evidence against the defendant was a confession.
I spoke, but before I started doing like Northern Ireland related stuff, I actually spoke to a gentleman named Marty Tancliffe, whose parents were murdered in his home. He came in the morning and discovered them, and there was a lot of like dodginess in terms of the police may have been involved and all that, but he was brought in this emotional wreck kind of state, and the detectives basically made him give a false confession, and then he spent so long trying to kind of undo that and explain it.
Very closely parallel. I mean, everything you just said is very close factually to what happened to Kevin Barry Artt. He was reduced to a wreck by the detectives. He felt he was at the end of his rope. He had to sign this piece of paper in front of him, or else terrible things were going to happen to his wife and his baby, and to him. And so he folded. He did it, which is not uncommon and wasn't uncommon back then. And the time, the effort, the toll of getting out from under that false confession, I mean, it took years. He tried in the Irish trial of the century in 1983 in front of Basil Kelly. He testified, was one of the very few defendants who testified in that trial in his own defense. And of course, he testified in the case in San Francisco, California. And it really ruined his life. That moment of very understandable weakness and vulnerability that produces a false confession.
And it's worth mentioning as well, the book goes into way more detail. But it's worth mentioning that it's not like they just kind of get you to say something in his case anyway. A lot of it was like them writing a particular sentence and just kind of trying to get him to say yes to it, which is a lot easier than making you say the whole words and get it out of you. It's really crazy when you think about it.
All of that is correct, John. And in addition, these detectives were so good, if that's the right adjective to use, at their craft. They knew the importance of embroidering the confession a little bit with just enough detail that would make it seem to the judge like this was a valid confession. How could the guy have remembered this little detail unless it's a valid confession that he's made? And they did that in the case of Kevin Barry Artt. They went back to him after they got him to confess to shooting Albert Miles, and they got him to confess to some other thing involving, Moley's garage or something, which was completely made up, but it was just a little more embroidery to make it seem a little more real. And of course, the judge, Basil Kelly, when the time came, looked at that and found it convincing.
Okay, so the second place that you very that you personified very, very well in the book, kind of literally almost made a character of, was Lawton Kesh, a place which held a prison known as the Maze. Again, you might kind of fill us in on the details of that place.
Well, the Maze was built because the British were ending what they considered to be a failure, the failure of internment, the failure of allowing Republican prisoners to be in a barracks type of environment where they were treated with special category status, or essentially as political prisoners or POWs under the Geneva Convention. It was felt that, these prisoners were participating in military style drills, and then when they were leaving the cages, they were going straight back into active service, and they'd formed all these relationships and developed all this knowledge and expertise in the meantime. So the Maze was contemplated as a cellular prison. Prisoners would be in cells, not in barracks. They wouldn't be allowed to associate freely with one another. They would be treated essentially as common criminals. Special category status would be taken away. And most importantly, the Maze would be made escape-proof. So they built it on a British Ministry of Defense base as really a prison within a military base, which had multiple gates and barriers that would supposedly make the place escape proof. And they started imprisoning Republican prisoners there and phased out the cages during the late 70s.
Okay, so the murder that we're referring to that Kevin Barry Artt was falsely convicted for was like you mentioned a fairly high up prison staff named Albert Miles. The book goes into like plenty of detail about what various people had to say about him. Okay, so Albert Miles's 1979 murder came as a part of this kind of subculture, sub conflict, excuse me, within the Troubles. This was this very vicious, escalating conflict that exists between the prisoners of the various H blocks and the prison guards. It was this escalating kind of series of tit for tat and measures, and they do this, or we do that, and we do it. Okay, so you might fill us in on like the context that led up to this murder, this being the blanket protests.
Well, the blanket protests started in the maze when the prison service, the British government, with the prison service as their arm, took away special category status, and that meant prisoners would have to wear uniforms. Prisoners would be required to do prison work. There would be limits on the number of parcels and visits they could get, and so forth. And these prisoners felt that that was a very grave affront to the history of the Republican movement and to the dignity of what they were doing. And a prisoner named Kieran Nugent was the first to be handed a uniform, and he refused it and said, I'm not going to wear it. And others followed suit. And that was the beginning of what was called the blanket protest. It was cold in the Maze prison, especially in the winter months. The prisoners did have a blanket. And so rather than wear a uniform and having had their clothes impounded by the guards, they would wear a blanket just to ward off the chill. That escalated into something that was called the no wash protest, or the dirty protest, whereby prisoners were confined to their cells, which did not have toilets or any facilities for washing. And the guards didn't take it well. They beat the prisoners. And as you said, there was sort of a tit for tat escalation of protest by Republican prisoners and maltreatment of those prisoners, punishment of them by the guards. And Albert Miles was the deputy governor of the Maze, something that Americans would call a deputy warden of the prison. And so these guards were acting under his supervision, and Albert Miles was thought of as directing a lot of the cruelty. He had, bad encounters with Jerry Kelly and with others. And like some of his colleagues in the prison service, he became the victim of what was a campaign of assassination of prison officials on the outside by the IRA. And that culminated in his murder on the night of November 26, 1978, in front of his wife, Florence, and their son, Alan.
The book did a very good job of going into these the kind of nitty gritty visceral details of this blanket and no wash protest. I mean, we're talking about yeah, the reason the reason they started with the defecating in buckets and stuff was because on the way to the bathrooms they would get a vicious beating. So they said, okay, we're not going to go. And then they had a bucket in the cell, and the bucket got taken away. Then when the guards were collecting it, they would try to knock some of it in on top of the prisoners. Prisoners would do the same. They changed the windows. It's like this constant kind of escalation back and forth. Really good account. Really good account in the book of that kind of camp.
You stated it exactly right. The guards were, every time a man left his cell to go wash or use the bathroom, he could expect a beating by guards that were enraged by the protests that were going on up to that point, which made their jobs harder. made the shift a lot more unpleasant, and really viewed their prisoners as inferiors. As they, one of their favorite phrases, Fenian scum, and other words that are worse than that, or more profane than that. And there were prisoners that, were involved in this protest for several years. And, just imagine, living in those squalid conditions in those tight quarters and, doing it for what you believe in.
I spoke to well, okay, I've interviewed two former blanket men, but only one where we actually spoke about the thing itself. And yeah, obviously anyone familiar with it would know that at one stage, at a certain stage, they started wiping their own excrement all over the wall to make the cell more inhospitable for the guards. The guards would be less likely to come and give them a kicking. Obviously because they have nothing to wash with themselves, so they're getting their own excrement under their fingernails, it's in their hair. Can't wash. When they would sleep, they would often wake up with maggots crawl into their mouth and nose and stuff. Yeah, crazy stuff.
Yeah. And, all of that, of course, culminated in, the British were not going to back down. Once Margaret Thatcher took office, Thatcher hated the IRA, and, she felt very strongly that these men were common criminals, that the IRA was a terrorist organization, a criminal gang, and there was not to be any compromise with people like that. And by 1980, it was clear after years of these protests, the blanket protests, the dirty protests, that it was not producing results. And the human cost of it was high. The IRA was not doing well in its struggle. And that led to the hunger strikes, which started in 1980 and led to the deaths of 10 men.
That stat at one stage, I think during those protests, I'm trying to find the stat, but at one stage during those protests, there was actually more men. There was more IRA men inside than there was outside, and there was more than had been interned in these in the internment at the beginning too. Yeah, to your.
That's right. And John, as you say, this was a reflection of what the Maze prison became in terms of its significance to the Troubles. The Maze prison, as I would see it, became really the focal point or a crucible of the conflict. The combatants were the Republican prisoners and the prison service. And the international media started paying attention to it. And I remember as a college student at the time reading about Bobby Sands, and I was a kid from Southern California. I was very unschooled in the Troubles. The US media did not do a good job of explaining the conflict and what its roots were, and made it really hard to understand. As a naive American, I wanted to know, of course, immediately, who are the good guys and who are the bad guys, and it was a little more complicated than that. But the worldwide media paid attention to Bobby Sands, and for many people, including me, it was the first time they'd ever really learned anything about Northern Ireland and the Troubles.
Interesting. That's interesting. Okay, so Albert Miles's murder was part of this campaign against prison guards, where extremely mistreated prisoners would get the word out that this particular person or that particular person needs to go. Whether no matter whose kind of side of it you're on, or who you think is more favored or anything. It's worth mentioning that of 6 men who came and paid their respects at Albert Miles's house, 6 fellow prison guards, 5 themselves would meet a similar fate. It's a chilling thing when you think that 5 out of the 6 who walked through the door after he died met a similar end. Yeah, you might tell us. We might get into the night of the murder that Kevin Barry later got caught up in having, even though he had nothing to do with it.
That night was a Sunday night. It was chilly out. It was November night in Belfast. The family had just finished dinner, Albert and his wife Florence and their son Alan, who was 21 years old at the time. And the family was relaxing in the living room. The radio was playing. There was a knock at the door. Florence went to answer it. And like a lot of homes in this area at the time, there was an internal vestibule door, or what might be called a porch door, then a vestibule or a porch, and then the outer door, the front door. So Florence passed through that vestibule door so as to go and open the front door. She asked who it was. The answer was, oh, it's Butler from across the road. She cracked the door, and then whoever was on the outside forced his way in and pushed her to the side of the vestibule. She screamed. Alan heard her, and Albert heard her. So Albert came sort of rushing toward the front door in response to that. And the trailing man of this two-man team fired several shots. The first one went wide and high, I would suppose because he was taking pains not to hit his accomplice. The rounds passed through the glass of the vestibule door, and Alan was struck by several rounds, but the one that killed him was sort of a coup de grace when he was laying face down on the carpet. The gunman reached through the broken glass of the vestibule door with a .45 and put a round in the middle of his back. It severed, a large artery near his heart, and he died. The gunman got away quickly, got out of the neighborhood. Neighbors, heard the noise of it. Alan Miles got on the phone, called police, called for an ambulance. They arrived, but they couldn't do anything for Albert Miles.
Actually,
gunmen were not wearing masks or hoods, and Alan Miles saw them. He saw their faces. And it was significant to me when I first started studying this case and the trial that was held in the Belfast Crown Court that Alan Miles was not called witness by the prosecution to identify the gunman. He wasn't called as a witness at all. Florence Miles was called and was asked if she could identify the gunman in the courtroom, and she said, "No, I don't see him." So that right there is a suggestion that possibly they had accused the wrong man.
Of course. There's actually something you pointed out in the book. It kind of highlights the smallness of the place, I suppose. I mean, Belfast is smaller than Dublin. I think, on a global scale, Dublin wouldn't even be that particularly like kind of big of a place. Kevin Barry, actually, who would later go down for this murder, unbeknownst to himself, actually drove Albert Miles's headstone to the graveyard. That was wow, that was like a bizarre little thing in the book that got my attention. It shows you the kind of the intimacy of the place.
It is a crazy or seemingly crazy coincidence. He worked for Robert Hart Memorials at the time, a stonemason business, and some weeks had passed after Albert Miles had been killed. Florence went to Robert Hart Memorials to order up a headstone and all of that. And the laborer who got to drive the headstone over to Carnmoney Cemetery was Kevin Barry Artt. Of course, he hadn't been charged with the killing at the time, and he arranged the stones over the grave. And that grave is still there today. And when you visit it, you can still see the little logo, the little piece of advertising that the headstone vendor, puts on there to remind everybody where it came from. Robert Hart Memorials on the lower left part of that grave site.
Okay, so I've done plenty of episodes with the theme of security forces, agents acting to say unethical would be a gross understatement, but yeah, basically paramilitaries who are working for a particular security force agent, security force group, this case the RUC. A lot of them it wouldn't quite be an exaggeration to say they had a license to kill and they could get away with some unbelievable stuff. You might fill us in a little bit on Maurice Gilvarry and how he plays into the story.
Well, Maurice Gilvarry was an IRA man, and he became a double agent, a traitor, an informant, and he really did have a license to kill, and he committed killings of a British prison official and his wife, Albert Mackin. The couple's name was Mackin. And he broke into their house and shot them while they were watching TV in circumstances that are very similar to what happened to Albert Miles. He hijacked a car that night, November 26, 1978, that matched the description of the car that was seen speeding away from the Miles home after the shooting. You know, he was sort of cursorily questioned afterwards, and of course allowed to go without any charges. He set up several of his comrades in ambushes in which they were killed. Eventually, the IRA figured out what Maurice Gilvarry was doing, and they lured him under a ruse into a trap, and he wound up killed with a bullet to the back of the head, which was the preferred method of the nutting squad in 1981 in South Armagh. So Maurice Gilvarry figures, you know, pretty heavily in the story, and I feel strongly that, you know, he did kill Albert Miles. And Alan Miles, who I'm friends with today and who lives in England today, read this book, and I was a little bit on pins and needles, wondering how he would like it, if he would like it, you know, if he wouldn't like it, whatever. And I met with him in New York last November. We had dinner and spent a few hours with him and his son. And he said, when I turned to the page that had the photograph of Maurice Gilvarry, it instantly hit me. This was the man I saw on the front step of my parents' house that night.
My God, that's
So I felt like maybe I got it right, you know.
so I don't want to. I want to leave the telling of the story to the book. I suggest
Oh,
anyone who's listened this far, you will love the book. It's brilliantly written. You'll learn lots about different aspects of not just Kevin Barry Artt's life, but the troubles themselves, the Long Kesh, Castlereagh, the blanket protest. Excellent book. We might fast forward to Kevin Barry being in prison. He's been falsely convicted. The book goes into the trial. I'll kind of leave that for the book. So somewhat of a common theme, I guess, in Kevin Barry's life is that he gets caught up to no fault of his own. He kind of gets caught up in the plans and the battles of others. So I'm talking about the troubles themselves. Then he gets caught up in this prisoner versus guard battle that's going on. And then once he's in prison, he gets caught up in a prison escape that he had nothing to do with planning, didn't even know about it until the day of it. You might take us to when Kevin Barry gets called into a prison cell, thinking that he's in trouble for smuggling in some hash, but he's actually getting offered an ejector seat.
the IRA was very anti-drug, and they disapproved of you know, narcotics, use of narcotics by their men. And when Kevin Barry Artt arrived at the maze, as it had been when he was on remand at Crumlin Road Jail, which he was for over 2 years after his arrest, he felt very much excluded by the IRA men that were there, because he was an outsider. He wasn't in the IRA. He wasn't, you know, from a neighborhood, from a Catholic neighborhood originally. You know, he'd grown up in White House, you know, which was a fairly prosperous area, and really been shielded from a lot of the troubles until he was 15. So the escape, which was planned meticulously by Larry Marley and Jerry Kelly and Brendan McFarlane, had a list of prisoners attached to it that would be allowed to go on that day. And that list, as you would guess, would have some big names on it. The IRA was looking for, a publicity splash. They were also looking to put some very valuable people back at liberty. And they also cared about people that were doing life as opposed to guys that maybe had 2 or 3 years to go. Kevin Barry Artt's name was not on the list until the morning of, and it's not clear, how exactly he got on the list, but he did. Bobby Story was probably the person to say that it was okay. He had a conversation with Jerry Kelly. There was a cell called Cell 26 where they used to meet clandestinely and talk about this. So Kevin was sitting in the dining room eating his lunch. It was about 12:30 p.m. on September 25, 1983. Another prisoner came up to him and said, "Barry, they want you in cell 26." And he was afraid of getting a beating or getting reprimanded because he had done some hash, and he was friendly with these INLA guys, and the IRA didn't like the INLA and so forth. So he assumed the worst when he went in there, but he was told, "There's an escape on today. You're serving a life sentence. You're entitled to go if you want." And he said, "This is a pretty easy call. I'm doing life plus 15 years. How much more time could the court give me if I were to get caught?" So he just said, "What do I have to do?" And they said, "Come to the circle when we call you. That'll be around 3 o'clock. You're going to ride in the back of the lorry to the Tally Lodge. There'll be some cars waiting there." And, that was it. He was all for it.
Yeah, it's funny as well. His role, I mean, there was lots of different, there was lots of jobs in terms of managing this prison. There was a lot of different jobs that had to be done precisely. He literally, all he had to do was just be at a particular place and then jump into the back of a truck. It was a complete like free ticket.
I mean, the term "the accidental tourist," I think that was the name of a movie. He was sort of the accidental escapee, or, Zelig comes to mind, being in the right place at the right time, and, luck entering into it. So, yeah, that is one of the interesting aspects of the story.
Okay, the book as well. There's several chapters on this prison escape. Brilliant. The most thrilling part of this very thrilling book was those chapters for me anyway. Those chapters on the prison escape. I kept thinking every time I was reading, I kept thinking, please, someone make a movie of this, because I want to see all this on screen. Hopefully, can you go through maybe some of the kind of the broad strokes of this very complicated prison escape, which you went into in great detail?
Sure. Escapes had been tried before, tunnels and so forth. The British were very adept at detecting those, using ground penetrating radar and, forcing the prisoners to fill them back in. So a new approach was needed, and the mastermind was a prisoner named Larry Marley. He was 36 years old and from Ardoyne, and he had tried to escape multiple times. His nickname was Papillon. But this was a puzzle, this property sitting on 360 acres. No one prisoner had seen the entire, facility. Nobody knew, what an aerial view of it would look like. Each one of the 8 H blocks was a prison within a prison, a self-contained unit sitting inside another self-contained unit, and all of it encircled by an 18-foot wall made of steel reinforced concrete with snipers, stationed on towers. And no one knew the whole layout. The guards would transport prisoners when they arrived or, went somewhere else in blacked out vans so you wouldn't be able to see. And each H block had its own secure communications room. It was behind 2 locked doors. There were double gated, vehicle locks around every H block. So there were many obstacles and a lot of opportunities for failure, a lot of redundancy built into this design. But Marley decided the way out was in a kitchen truck. There was a kitchen truck that went around to each one of the H blocks every day. Each H block had its own cafeteria and cooking facilities, and this food truck would come around and drop off food for the prisoners. What if you could overpower the guards, take their uniforms, hijack the food truck, put a bunch of men in the back, maybe you could get 35 or a few more in the back, and then pass through a series of airlock gates with prisoners disguised as guards and the usual orderly who drove the truck in the cab to give the appearance of, legitimacy, and then drive it out the front gate. And sometimes the trucks were, driven off the property. A guy might drive the truck home, for the weekend if he had his superior officer's permission to do it. And then there would be a team from South Armagh that would be waiting. It would receive the prisoners in the truck and then disperse all of them very fast before the British could figure it out. The rear guard would take all the identifying information, the files of each escapee, and burn them, so that by the time the authorities regained control of H7 and all the rear guard guys would be locked in their cells and had thrown away the keys outside, the authorities wouldn't be able to quickly figure out who had escaped. And this would allow more time to the escapees to get, wherever it was they were going to go, to their safe houses. So that was a plan.
A very, very interesting aspect of the prison escape that you usually don't get with prison escapes is that given the limited number that could escape, the whole plan itself required a lot more prisoners cooperating than escaped. So as a result, and in order to prevent like a big backlash on the remaining prisoners from the guards, they actually had to walk a bit of a tightrope, in that there was times when they tied up the guards and had them in very vulnerable positions. These, of course, were guards that they had a very adversarial relationship with, and they could have extracted some physical revenge, like when you have someone tied up on the floor, you just walk around to all of them and kick them in the face if you wanted to, like had been done to them. But they were under strict instructions and not to take out personal grievances, because then the guys left behind would have to deal with that.
That's exactly right. And, that came from the leaders. Jerry Kelly, who was very generous with his time and gave me a couple of interviews, felt very strongly that guards were to be treated humanely, and no guard was to be killed or injured unless there was absolutely, unless the escape itself was at risk. I think they wanted to show, in addition to having concern over the rear guard and how they were going to be treated later, they wanted to show the world that they were not the same as the guards. They were not filled with hate, and they were not into cruelty. And the message that was delivered to the guards was written out and then read to the guards who were tied up in H7 by a prisoner named Kieran Fleming. And I won't read the whole thing to you, but just a small snippet of it. He told them, and I quote, "To conclude, we give you our word as Republicans that none of you will come to any harm, providing you cooperate fully with us. Anyone who refuses to do so will suffer the ultimate consequence, death. Allow common sense to prevail. Do not be used as cannon fodder by the prison administration or the faithless bureaucrats at Stormont and Whitehall. It is not our intention to settle old scores, ill-treat, or degrade any of you, regardless of your past."
Okay, so it was successful in that 19 ended up escaping in the end, but that could have easily been 0 escaping, because it very nearly went wrong. You might tell us about that part.
Right when they got to the front gate, the one black box that nobody really had any specific insight into was, once you get to the control panel, how do you open that front gate? Or how do you make the man that is stationed there open that gate? Well, he's obviously going to know now that you are, engineering an escape and you need his cooperation. They got the gate partly open, but by this time, what was happening inside the tally lodge were the guards who had been immobilized and tied up and made to sit on the floor under at gunpoint, were fighting back. They were not going to go gently or easily. And one of the guards who was coming onto the shift saw what was happening. There was sort of a melee unfolding just inside the pedestrian gate outside the Tally Lodge, and he drove his vehicle around to the front gate to block it from opening so that that kitchen truck could not exit. And after he did that, I think it was Bobby Story opened up the back of the truck and said, "It's every man for himself." And guys started scrambling and going out through this front gate, like geese going through a little opening in a fence. And all hell broke loose, at that moment.
Okay, like I said, we'll leave the actual story, the telling of it to the book. But Kevin Barry eventually ended up actually in the part of the world that you are out the West Coast.
He was one of 5 who made it to California. The other 4 being Jimmy Smith, Terry Kirby, Paul Brennan, and Anthony McAllister.
Very good. How was speaking of yourself, how does an American end up I guess interested in this and interested to the point where you wrote such an excellent book on it?
Thank you, John, for saying that. I was a young lawyer at the time. When Kevin Barry Artt was arrested, it made headlines here locally and other places too. A public defender was appointed for him right away, a guy named Mark Geller, who I didn't know personally, but he knew that my law firm, the law firm that I was then with, did asylum applications for immigrants that were fleeing persecution. And, our firm did that pro bono. I had done some of those cases all for Central Americans, I think, Salvadorans and Guatemalans at that time. And I talked to him on the phone, and he said, "Look, I'm going to be getting out of this case because they're going to be transferring up to the Bay Area. Why don't you go talk to him? He's probably got an asylum case." And I said, "Yeah, sure, why not?" And I went over there sight unseen. I'd never met Kevin Barry Artt before. They brought him out, in chains with 3 guards on him, and handed him my card and told him who I was and why I was there. And he regarded me very warily, but he was open with me. He told me his name right away. He'd been living here under an alias, Kevin Cohane. And right away, when I asked him his name, he said, "I'm Kevin Barry John Artt." He said that he'd confessed, but then he was quick to add that the confession was false. He hadn't done it. And right before I got up to leave, he said, "You could escape from this place." And I sort of pretended not to hear him, and he said, "If you had a motorcycle down on the street and some explosives to blow a hole through this wall and, a rope to shimmy down, but you could make it out of sheet, you could get out of here." And I just said, "Good night," But I came away from that meeting not knowing, it all sounded so fantastical and hard to believe, frankly. And if you practice law for long enough, you learn that you're going to have some clients and some people that tell you some stuff, and that stuff is not all necessarily true. They may believe it's true subjectively. So I sort of had some skepticism about the story that he told, but I felt this is an Irish guy on the run from the British government, and I'm going to help him.
Interesting. You then, the book is fairly recent. Can you talk to me a little about the time in between that?
The time in between the end of the case and then the writing of the book? Yeah, sure. The case out here, the extradition case, ended in the year 2000 after the Good Friday Agreement, and the federal courts basically ordered the British to drop the case because it was moot. What are you going to do if you get these guys back? You're just going to have to walk them as soon as they arrive at the airport. What's the point of an extradition? I had withdrawn from doing any legal work for him by that time. Morrison and Forster was is doing an amazing job of taking care of him in that case. But we stayed friends, and I can't tell you exactly when I got the notion of trying to write this story, but I did get that notion at some point and broached it with him, and we started talking about a book. Um, he had some trepidation about it for all the reasons you could, imagine. And I think several years passed during which we talked about a contract, a collaboration agreement, and I think maybe 7 years. And then finally in 2016, we both signed. It was important to me that he get, a lawyer, an independent lawyer, to look at this agreement. It was also important to me that he agree to waive his attorney-client privilege so that the reader could feel that nothing had been sanitized, nothing had been hidden behind the shield of the attorney-client privilege. And he, to his credit, agreed to that. And then I guess I thought in 2016, John, that I was going to write this story at night and on weekends. And pretty quickly, it became clear that just, that wasn't going to happen. There was too much volume. There was so much data. There'd been these two huge cases on each side of the Atlantic. It was going to require full time. And at one point, I think I despaired of ever being able to do this project because I thought, how am I going to be able to take a year off of, my law practice to give full time to this? But in 2018, some good things happened, financially in the law practice. And I had a window under our contract in which I had to deliver a finished book, or else all the rights went back to him. And I just realized, if you don't do it now, you're never going to do it. This is the moment. I laid off my employees and I jumped into it full time. And 16 months later, I had a manuscript.
Excellent. And like I said, if you've listened this far, you'll love the book. I'll put a link below. By the time we put out this episode, it's out already, right?
Yes, it's out. You can find it on Amazon or Barnes and Noble. It's called Above the Ground, A True Story of the Troubles in Northern Ireland. But tomorrow, John, Thursday, May 16th, it's being released in Europe in bookstores under a different name, Hunted, by Marion Press, which is an Irish publisher. And, your Irish listeners will be able to find it in bookstores in Ireland and in Scotland and the UK. And it's mostly the same. It has some of the history, some of the historic background taken out because that would be Coles to Newcastle for a lot of readers over there.
Very good. I was going to say, yeah, like I said, there was so many points in this book. The story itself, completely true, but like it almost could be like a fictional thriller in that there's like you couldn't make some of it up, Do you any plans or anything to get it into like a movie or TV series or anything? I guess it wouldn't be you doing it, but
It has been optioned. As of a couple of months ago, I optioned the screen rights to a couple of producers, and there are a couple of names that you would recognize that are now involved in writing a script, and there's a real director attached to it. So there's an awful lot of hurdles or landmines or both, in bridging that gap between here's a book and here's a movie hitting the big screen. So who knows, but I hope it will come to the big screen and that people will be able to see it.
absolutely. I certainly hope it does, be it a movie or a Netflix thing or whatever. Yeah, it will make for fantastic viewing. Thank you very much now for everything, all your time. Thank you for writing the book. Where can we find you? I know that on Instagram, actually anyone on Instagram should follow you. You post you have these really good good detailed historical posts about the Troubles. They're excellent.
Well, I was lucky. I had a couple of research assistants when I was working on this project, and part of their job was to sort of go out and find good images, good photos, and bird dog licenses to them. So I collected, a few hundred of them. And what I try to do on the Instagram page is give you, a good photo that might be interesting to you, and then a caption underneath that tells a little story about it. But that's Dan Lawton Writer on Instagram. Just look for that. And then the website for the book is abovethegroundbook.com, or if you go to Amazon and just plug in Above the Ground by Dan Lawton, or on Goodreads, you'll find it in those places too. And thanks to our friends at Merriam Press, you should be able to find it on a shelf if you live in Ireland or Scotland or the UK.
Sure. I was going to say big shout out to Marion Press. I've interviewed tons of their writers. They do excellent work. Some brilliant books get produced over there. Yeah.
They're just terrific. I mean, Connor Graham, Kira Kinsella, Connor Holbrook, Sheena Quinn, Wendy Logue. I mean, they're so professional, and they really care about the details and getting it exactly right. And I hope the readers will feel and the reviewers will feel that they've done that.
Thank you very much. Go buy the book. It's fantastic. Like I said, link in the podcast and in the YouTube. Dan, thanks a million. Thanks for all your time.
You're welcome, John. You have a great show. Thanks so much for doing it.